for climate preparedness and community resilience. I'm going to turn the podium over to our partner, David Herring, and his team has been here for the whole conference, but we've worked with David through all three conferences, as well as worked with him on the Climate Resilience Toolkit, which is basically what he's been an architect for, along with his team. And I know a number of you have been introduced to this toolkit through many of our presentations over the last 2 days. So David is going to be Masters of Ceremony today, so David Herring.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to day 3 of the 2018 Local Solutions Eastern Climate Preparedness Conference. How are you all feeling? Like it's time to get outside. I think summertime is officially arriving today, so let's get outside and enjoy that. Before I move into sort of setting the table and introductions for our plenary session this morning, a few items of business that we wanted to address. First of all, we want to thank all of the students who submitted poster boards for their research. Outstanding work represented in the posters, so if you haven't seen them, I encourage you to go check them out today at the breaks or the lunchtime. Yes, absolutely. There were a wide range of excellent topics covered, and the judging was challenging because of the quality of the submittals. So that's a good problem to have. And now we're pleased to announce the choice of the conference poster of the year. So drum roll, please. The poster is titled 2016 Climate Reporting Problems Across Political Spectrums. The author is Christine Thompson from Miami University. Christine, are you here? So would you please stand as we recognize? I don't have a plaque or anything to give you at this time, but I would like to shake your hand. Congratulations. Again, please go check out that outstanding poster, Christine. Congratulations again. We also want to announce that Dean's Beans from Orange, Massachusetts, it's a purveyor of sustainably grown coffee from around the world. They've graciously agreed to donate 30 bags of coffee to be given out by Antioch University. So if you'd like a bag, drop off a business card or your name and organization on a sheet of paper at the Antioch booth over in the exhibit hall. So thank you to Dean's Beans. Also, Badger, which is based in Gilson, New Hampshire, has donated bags of sunscreen and other body care products. If you would like to have a chance of receiving these, stop by the Ecovation booth and drop your name in the basket. We will announce the names for both Dean's Beans and Badger raffles at lunch. So I think that'll be right here in the hall at lunch. Also, just as an ongoing reminder, Antioch has been very good about wanting to evaluate each and every of the sessions, including this next one coming up. So on your tables there are evaluation forms, so please be sure to take a moment to share your thoughts about this and all of the sessions that you attend today. So again, thank you for your time and attendance this morning. Again, my name is David Herring. I direct the Communication, Education, and Engagement Division within NOAA's Climate Program Office. I'm based in Silver Spring, Maryland. And it's an honor and a privilege and a pleasure to be here and to be serving as a co-sponsor of this outstanding event, which has been really stimulating and fun to participate in. So thank you to Antioch University for this opportunity. In today's session, we're going to talk about business continuity. Show of hands, how many of you know what this term refers to? Wow, you all are better than me. I had to ask the definition of this, but it's generally referring to steps taken to ensure that the business or whatever entity we're talking about, organization, is able to continue performing its essential functions under a broad range of circumstances. And as we know, climate is increasingly one of those emerging circumstances that's presenting challenges that may disrupt continuity of our businesses, our systems. So not just the ongoing problem of climate change, global climate change, but there are also intermittent climate variability induced and weather-related shocks that can impact our businesses and our continuity. And so what will it take to remain robust in the face of a variety of challenges that we face today and that we will inevitably face over the course of this century? What must businesses do to plan and prepare? I think we all recognize it likely won't mean business as usual, quote unquote. And so in a little bit I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. He's going to tee up that conversation, but I thought I would offer a little bit of perspective from the science community. A motivating factor for this deliberation, of course, is the fact that our world is rapidly rising. As you can see, in the late 1800s to the first part of the 20th century, climatologically speaking, we were in a particular neighborhood. This line representing sort of the 20th century average temperature, and each bar representing each year's departure from that average. And so in the mid-20th century, we were sort of moving into a different neighborhood, and then we've gradually been stepping up, in which in each successive decade, the average of that, each year of the following decade after the 80s has been warmer than the average of the preceding decade. And most notably, a little bit disappearing off the right-hand side, we had 3 consecutively warm, record-setting warm years in the observational record, with 2017 being the 3rd warmest. So the 4 warmest years on record have been the last 4 years, and 16 of the 17 have occurred since, warmest years have occurred since 2000. NOAA, a colleague of mine, Stephanie Herring, puts out every year in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society a special report, a special edition in which they do attribution research. They look specifically at extreme events and ask the question, is there a connection to global climate change or global warming? What was particularly interesting, they've done this now 6 years in a row, so this was the 6th special issue that they put out here. And according to the authors, in this report, we crossed a milestone, or a threshold, I should say, in that this was the first time that they are pointing to extremes that would not have happened were it not for climate change. So what that's saying is that now circumstances are pushing us beyond the realm of natural variability, and we're seeing extremes reaching levels of extreme that would not have been possible in a pre-industrial climate. 21 of the 27 events studied in this particular issue were identifying climate change as a significant driver in the event, while 6 did not. And of the 131 papers examined over the last 6 years, 65% have identified climate change as a significant driver in causing the event or causing it to be more extreme, while 35% have not found connection, which is another interesting takeaway, of course, is that extreme events can and do occur with or without climate change. And so we were talking earlier about the need to be adaptive and to be ready to adapt, in addition to climate change, but also the motivating factor of variability and just natural extreme weather events. NOAA also tracks over time, going back to 1980, the number of billion-dollar disasters. These are events in which the total combined costs or of damages in an event exceed $1 billion. And so what you're seeing on the left-hand side is a count of the number of billion-dollar disasters. This one's parsed by month, and then you can see the cumulative total. So this would be the long-term average, and then the colored lines going back into 2008, you can see where overall the number of events over the course of the year in the United States exceeding $1 billion in damages has been climbing well above the average, and we can see that the total cumulative costs through the course of the year by year as well has been steadily climbing, with the last year going over $300 billion in damages. So there's a heavy toll. We'll often hear that there's costs to take action, costs associated with taking action, but as we can see, there are also costs associated with inaction. And so what it looks like, of course, in the places where we work, places where we run our businesses, and the places where we live, We're seeing what these events look like now, playing out in the headlines and the news reports. Flooding damage from Hurricane Harvey, extensive wildfires in California, followed by atmospheric rivers bringing very heavy rain, which has led to mudslides in California. This is a fairly recent map showing drought in the United States, so just a few snapshots of how climate variability and change is representing hazards to people and property. Right here where we are in Hillsborough County, New Hampshire, this is a screenshot from the Climate Explorer tool. We're going to update, roll out a new version of this in just a couple of weeks. We can select from different decision-relevant variables here on the left-hand side, and we can show you the envelope here, the shaded regions being an ensemble of about 36 models, global climate models, and this has been downscaled for every county in the contiguous United States. And what you're seeing here is the shade from 1950 to about 2008. This is what the models predicted in hindcast. This is a 30-year average from 61 to 90, and you can see where each year has departed from the average. And then this is projected out into the future. So this would be the count of days in which temperature is projected to exceed 90 degrees in this county for two different scenarios, a higher emission and a lower emission scenario. And as you can see, the models have been doing so far in the median value a pretty good job of representing what has been observed. And so, again, it's not just the fact that we have moved, climatologically speaking, into a different neighborhood, but we're projected to continue rapidly moving in the places where we live and where we work. So it's not somewhere else, somewhere far away, it's here where we are doing business. Similarly, in the new tool, we've provided stations where we're offering a count of the number of days of just sunny day flooding. A day like today where there's not a storm surge or a hurricane or some significant driver, it's just high tide flooding. And so the gray bars indicating the number of days per year, and then again what is projected for Providence, Rhode Island at this tidal station out to the year 2100 and two different emission scenarios. And so as you can see, we've had as many as 50 days of high tide flooding at that station in the last couple of years, and by say 2040 that number could exceed 100 days, and by the end of the century, as you can see, almost every day is experiencing what we would characterize as sunny day flooding. So what will it take to be resilient going forward into that future? I was really moved and inspired by the presentations yesterday by Susie Mosier and Nina Marie Lister. And I thought I would take a moment to also share with you, I highly recommend an interesting read. It's a collection of essays previously published in the Harvard Business Review titled On Managing Yourself. And in particular, there's an essay on how resilience works. And the author gathered firsthand testimonials from people who had been spending time in prison camps, concentration camps, or in prison or solitary confinement. And she pulled together a list of what are the key characteristics that we as individuals and that we in businesses and business entities should keep in mind when we find ourselves in very trying circumstances. First and foremost is what she characterized all of these individuals who were resilient in these extreme circumstances had a staunch acceptance of reality, an ability to sort of stare down the barrel of where you find yourself, what the circumstances are, and to accept some of the harsh realities, and particularly focusing in on the parts of reality that matter for survival or for your ability to maintain your continuity. So this is really involving more than optimism. It's involving people who are able to just think about sort of creatively what it takes to devise solutions for yourself in moving forward. Optimism is good so long as it doesn't distort your understanding of reality. A lot of people were hopeful in the concentration camps that they would be home by Christmas, and when that didn't happen, they despaired. And so what people realize is just sort of accepting the situation, avoiding denialism, but instead focusing on creative solutions. And what that often involves is a search for meaning, an ability to make meaning and to devise for yourself a narrative that can serve as a bit of a construct to bridge from the present into the future. In making this meeting, for example, one of the individuals who was interviewed imagined himself teaching a college course on how to survive in circumstances like this, and he went on to innovate a whole branch of psychology when he finally got out. And so having this narrative and making this meaning for yourself can make the circumstances seem less overwhelming and more manageable, provide sort of a kind of bridge from the present into the future. And then continually improvise. This is something in particular that the business community is really good about at doing, imagining and innovating new possibilities, making do with the resources that you have. Sometimes budget times are lean, but invent and build your bridge into that future, using the resources that you have and creativity, which can, again, be empowering and help you to think about how to go from the present into a more desirable future. So I thought I would use that as a bit of a springboard into bringing up our moderator and our keynote speaker for this session on business continuity. And I think in this regard, we're in very good hands. Our keynote speaker has shown remarkable resilience and resourcefulness and innovative problem solving throughout his more than 40-year career. Bob Perciasetti has been a leader both within and outside government. He served as Deputy Administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency, where he led the way in setting stricter auto emission standards and better gas mileage standards. He increased protections for our nation's rivers and streams, and he developed carbon emission standards for power plants. Currently, Bob serves as President of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, which is widely recognized in the United States and internationally as a leading independent voice for practical policy and action to address our energy and climate challenges. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Bob Perciasetti.
Well, good morning again, everyone. I'm glad you're now awake after looking at all that science. It's daunting, and it is, it's relentless. And I have a couple of things that highlight some of the points that were made. But before I do this, I do want to thank Antioch for having this wonderful conference. And this is my third time coming. It's great. The climate, the Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience, and NOAA for co-sponsoring. It's easy to frown a bit every once in a while on the lack of engagement sometimes in the federal government. I'm happy that NOAA's here and working hard. The carbon dioxide levels that are driving some of this are now bouncing around, early in the spring here in the Northern Hemisphere, or at least in Hawaii, at almost 410 parts per million. I mean, the average, global average this year will probably be more like 407 or something, but it has that, the more vegetation there is in the Northern Hemisphere, it's got this sinusoidal, I'll use that term, from mathematics, curve to it. When I was born, it was 315. It's gone up 30% just while I've been alive. And these are changes in atmospheric carbon levels that used to vibrate on million-year periods. This happened during my lifetime. So it's just, to me, it's like it's an awesome kind of thinking about how fast humans are changing the environment. And we saw the chart of the warmest years, and the last 4 years have been some of the four warmest, I think, in the last 100 years. But I don't know if anybody's paying attention to David's chart, but who can tell me when the last coolest day, the coolest year was? And I don't mean cool like with shades, I mean cool, cold temperature. Guess, somebody yell out a date, a year. 1909. 1909, over 100 years ago, was the last time Earth had a coolest year ever. Or at least in the recorded, I shouldn't say coolest year ever, it was probably back in the day, colder. But I mean in the record that we have going back to the 1880s. And then, a point on the damages and the billion-year storms, which I assume was adjusted for inflation into 2017 dollars, right? 2017 and 2011 were both the greatest number of billion-dollar-year disasters in the United States so far. And of course, that was the year that both Sandy and Irene occurred, 2011. And last year, we saw that the kinds of disasters are expanding greatly. Last year, we had droughts, we had fires in California, we had flooding. There were a diversity of climate accelerated, perhaps, or enhanced events that were taking place. And I was talking to folks just before, and I'll invite our panelists up in just a minute, about frequency of storms and how we think of frequencies of storms, and how whether climate's influencing something or not influencing something, and the attribution issue, which is a tough science question. But I try to break it down into something simple when I try to explain this phenomenon to people, whether it's a 100-year storm or a 1,000-year storm, or whether this hurricane had more rain in it or not because of climate change. And I say, think of holding two dice in your hand and rolling those dice, because this is a probability exercise, right? So you roll the dice and to try to get a double six. And I forget off the top of my head, it might be 1 in 36 or something is the actual probability of that. But if you throw the dice to get 2 sixes, and that's great in Monopoly, you keep doing it, right? Now, if you want to think about what climate change is doing to that probability, and the double six it would be a bad weather event, right? Not a good Monopoly move. So what climate change is doing is taking one of those dice and erasing the 5 and making that a 6 also. So now you have one of the dice has 2 sixes on it. And then as climate change keeps going, it takes the other dice and takes away one of the 5 and makes that a 6. So now you have 4 sides of the dice now have 6s on it. So when you roll it, the probability of it coming up keeps increasing. And so we're changing the probabilities in future by erasing the old faces of the dice and replacing them with 6s and then continuing to roll. And so you see over time what's happening is these probabilities are changing, and you can't completely look at the past meteorological or even hydrological record and make assumptions completely about the future without thinking about how those probabilities may be changing. So this is some of my little, sort of personal ways I think about some of the issues that David, you were just talking about and alerting everyone to. And these costs are real, obviously. These costs are real in terms of material things and also in human life. The increase in heat deaths, the people who died in rapid fires last fall in California, people die in flooding, and then there's the damages, which we always point to, but there's a human toll as well. And we always count that toll by the number of people who die, but there's a number of people who are miserable, in heat, don't have air conditioning, vulnerable populations. There are people who've had their homes destroyed or their neighbors' homes destroyed, and they're in psychological distress. There's a human toll that goes beyond that death number, which newspapers love to report, and it is something we do gauge things by at times. So these actions this phenomena is not significant. I mean, it's not insignificant in terms of how it impacts human well-being. And we're talking about the United States for the most part here, and extrapolate this to the rest of the world, where they don't, many parts of the world don't even have anywhere near the resources we have to struggle. And we're going to talk about how we're struggling here. So think of this as a global issue as well, that maybe the United States can help by showing how to deal with some of these issues. At C2ES, we work with businesses a lot and local governments to try to find these practical solutions. Some people think the word practical is a dirty word sometimes, but I think it's a great word, because if we try to be perfect, we'll never get there, and if we do nothing, that's not a good option. So we have to do something, and usually practical is good. But the buck stops, if I can use that term, on climate resilience at the local government and business level. I mean, policies are important, financial resources are important, But where the rubber meets the road is at that local level. We're going to hear a little bit about that in a minute. C2ES has studied looking at large businesses as well as small businesses and how they are responding. And I'm going to briefly go through this a little bit because there's a difference between large businesses and small businesses. The universal finding, though, is that the connecting tissue between local government and the businesses, whether they're large or small. If you're a large business, you have, like if you're like the Bank of America, you're going to have local, branch offices. So everybody, there's always a mix of these things, and you can't be always completely compartmentalizing it. But the one thing to remember is that the businesses in Manchester have employees. The city of Manchester has citizens. Those employees and citizens are the same people. And so when businesses are thinking about how their employees can fare or how they can get their employees back to work because for their own business continuity, they have to inevitably think about how are they going to work with the city to get their citizens up and running. I mean, the citizen's house may be destroyed, or their children may be hurt, or their financial resources may be drained, and the last thing they can think about is going to work. And yet, for continuity and resilience of a community, you need to get the businesses back up and running. So this interconnection is at the human level as well as the financial level. So in larger companies, there's a number of forces at play here. If you're a large company, you're doing more and more reporting about what your climate risks are. I mean, they're not all doing it, but many are, whether it's a Security Exchange Commission or whether you're voluntarily joining in with the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate Disclosure. Most large companies are now disclosing some aspect of their risk. And their investors are asking them to do this, even if they weren't doing it because of the Security Exchange Commission. So large companies with a lot of resources are now doing more and more to identify what their risks are. They're looking at their conventional planning processes. They have this paradox that they have to resolve inside their companies, which is a big struggle in a large company. Is it the response people, the people who I've had when something goes wrong and I can dispatch them to respond to fix it? Or is it the risk management people who try to think about not letting that happen in the first place, or the merger of the two? In some companies, those are in two different places in the company. They don't talk to each other. In some places, they're combined. But what risk management and resilience planning is forcing to happen at the large corporate level is for these things to start to be looked at together. And because it's the balance of those that you try to make work. There's a conference just this week in New York City that's looking at how companies, particularly large companies, can do scenario planning. And some of the stuff that Noah and David was talking about earlier is providing some resources for local communities and maybe the small businesses in those communities to try to do scenario planning. What am I like? How many faces of the dice are going to turn into a 6? That kind of thinking. And of course, there's always this risk transfer thing, right? Let's buy more insurance. But the insurance companies their patience is wearing thin on that. But there's still, and eventually it'll become too expensive. The other thing about large companies is they have supply chains, or they are distributed like a bank, a large national bank might be. And in the supply chains are lots of small businesses. So there's this interface here between the large and the small that I think is important. But large companies are paving the way in some of these things, and it's sometimes helpful to look at what they're doing. Let me say a little bit about small businesses. And I view, and I think at C2ES, we view the small business issue here on resilience planning and resilience preparedness as a vulnerable population. And it is underserved by what's been going on in terms of trying to deal with resilience planning. And yet, when something happens, it's the place where most of the work gets done. A year ago this month, C2ES released a framework for engaging small businesses. And Katie Maurer, who worked on it for us, is actually in the audience back there somewhere. Katie, raise your hand. There she is. She said she was back at the table. So, she was one of the authors of this report, and it's not surprising that they don't have the resources of a large business. But one of the things that's really important is that when you have a major event, and I'm curious to see what happened in Brattleboro and Wilmington, but when you have a major event in a city, in a town, 20% of the small businesses don't reopen. And the longer it goes, the higher that percentage comes. In fact, the percentage of them that don't open can get up to almost 90% if it goes on for a couple of weeks. So, and we looked at Maryland in particular, and I know there's a bunch of Marylanders here, or at least some. You know, there are 500,000 small businesses in the state of Maryland, and that's over 95% of the businesses in Maryland. And it represents 1/2 of the state workforce, and this is not unusual. Maryland is not an unusual event in this regard. So half to more than half of the workforce of the employment in most states, and in some cities and towns it's even higher, small businesses are the main source of employment. And so how do you work with these small businesses to get ahead of this and in the preparedness? So we focused on how state and local governments can reach out and engage with small businesses. And you know, these things may be self-evident, but what we found is that you have to use trusted messengers. There has to be an existing trust relationship for you to be able to work with small businesses in most cases. And I would say local lending institutions often have that trust relationship. You have to leverage existing channels of communication. Trying to come in and create a whole new approach to communicating when businesses don't have time to go to more meetings on something, but there are meetings that they do go to. There are coffee shops they do hang out in. There are diners that they have breakfast in. You have to, I mean it, that's where it is. You have to find these existing channels where communications can take place, and you have to, together with them as a local government and as our state government, identify where the opportunities are. And you have to tailor the messages to the local situation, which is the struggle with the science. The science, we've had global, now we're getting pretty good regionally. You know, trying to tell somebody in a small town or in a small business in a large town that how many, on average, how many days, you know, sunshine days there will be, you know, well, what does that mean for me? And so we're getting there. The information is getting there, but that tailoring is really, really important. And the other thing I think is extremely important when you're thinking about vulnerable and underserved populations, the majority of women-owned and minority-owned businesses in the United States are small businesses. And these are things that we've all worked hard to encourage, and so we want to make sure that they are paid attention to. So there's one last thing I'll mention on the small businesses. Sometime you can do what I call look up the chain. Because we always talk about the large businesses and look at their supply chain, but if you're a small business, sometime you can look up the chain. You know, like where are the goods you're purchasing coming from? And I'll use a simple example, Walmart. You may have a local Walmart in your town, but the big Walmart down in Arkansas, they're thinking about this. They're thinking about this big time, and there may be resources there. So you can look up chain sometimes to see where you might be able to get some more assistance. So I'm going to end my intro here, hopefully setting the stage for our discussion of Vermont. Is that, and another way to talk about, you know, the costs of resilience now versus the cost you pay later. Who here remembers mufflers on cars? Right? They're still there, but you never have to change them anymore. Part of that is because EPA took the sulfur out of gasoline. I'm just saying. And so when the gasoline burns, it doesn't create sulfuric acid anymore and eat away your mufflers. So Midas Muffler now does brakes. But Midas Muffler used to say, you could pay me now or you could pay me later. And that's basically what's going on here. We have to be able to deal with the fact that the dice are constantly being rolled. The probabilities are being messed with by climate change. And we can't wait for that triple six to be rolled. So we have to make sure that the businesses in the small communities and government in general are working together on this issue, because that's how the solutions are going to be. That's how the solutions are going to be found and invested in and financed. So I'm going to stop there with this introduction, and I hope that this has given us some food for thought. But I'm going to ask Dan Yates, who's the CEO of the Rattlesburg Savings and Loan, to come on up. Come on up, Dan. And Gretchen Havelock, who's the Community Economic Development Planner at Wilmington, Vermont. They may have many things they're going to talk about. You want me to give this to her? Okay. But I'm going to guess that some of it will have to do with Hurricane Irene and the recovery since then. Oops, there's a picture of it right there. So we did not talk about which one of you should go first, but are these yours, Irene? I mean,
these are mine.
Okay, I have to decide, don't I?
I'll be happy to go first, and then
Dan?
give Gretchen the
Dan,
majority of the
but we'll
time.
leave this up because this is a picture of Vermont.
Well, this is a good picture because that church that you see, the very building after that is where we have a branch. Happily, we opened that branch after this picture was taken, so it didn't impact us. Good morning. I don't know how many here have ever been to Brattleboro. Well, okay. So what I want to talk a little bit about, and I know I have 5 minutes, is disaster recovery, Hurricane Irene, Tropical Storm Sandy, and then how it impacted some of our businesses. So we as a federally insured financial institution are required, and it's good practice, to have a disaster recovery and business continuity plan. And we have a very robust and detailed plan. We have a disaster recovery team. So anytime we think there's something that could impact the ongoing operations of the bank, the team gathers and assesses what the risk is and what are the steps that we should take. In Vermont, we don't think about hurricanes, or haven't thought about hurricanes perhaps since 1938. We tend to think about what happens if there's a massive snowstorm that causes all kinds of damage, or something else. We do have earthquakes, although not significant. So when we started hearing about Irene coming, we got together, we started following the U.S. Navy has a website that has a great storm tracking link. So we're watching that. Yep, looks like it's going to come right through Brattleboro, and what do we do? So we put all of our plans in place, backup locations, who's going to do what. That Sunday, Irene rolls right through downtown Brattleboro. Of course, being interested to see what was going to happen, I immediately ran downtown to watch how much water was going to come. And as the water came up some of the streets, we lost power for 2 hours at the bank and opened up Monday morning, and everything was fine for us. Not so much for some of our customers. Those of you that have been to Brattleboro, there's a hotel on the lower part of Main Street called the Latches Hotel. And there was a restaurant in that hotel that in 2010 had completely renovated the lower level of the hotel into a beautiful restaurant. And standing in the parking lot of the Brattleboro Co-op across the Whetstone Brook, and this is just a little brook, watching the water break through one of the windows, and about 10 seconds later, break through on its way out one of the other windows. And it completely destroyed this business. He had an upstairs, so he continued to try and operate, but ultimately, he just had to shut down. He didn't have any flood insurance. Didn't own the building. The bank that had financed him consequently didn't require him to have flood insurance. Out of business. About a dozen people lost their jobs. Space is still empty. Hoping that it opens up soon. Another story, just down that same side street, we had financed an acquisition of a commercial piece of property for one of our customers. $2.5 million purchase price. Flood insurance was required. Those of you that are familiar with the National Flood Insurance Program may be aware that on a commercial property, $500,000 is the maximum amount of coverage that you can get, and on a residential property, $250,000 is the maximum you can get. In February of 2011, the borrower came to me and said, my flood insurance premium just went up from just under $4,000 a year to $30,000 a year. I want to drop the insurance. Sorry, you can't. You've got a mortgage on the property. Well, I'm going to pay it off because the property has been there for 100 years and it has never flooded. 6 months later, the property is completely wiped out on the inside. Damages exceeded $500,000. No flood insurance because the property had been there for 100 years and it never flooded. The property is now, after spending in excess of $500,000 to restore the property and having paid $2.5 million, she is now hoping to sell it for about $1 million. So these are real costs that our customers or our business people in town face. We also had a town that was all but cut off as a result of this water on the Deerfield River and a branch of that known as the Green River. Happily, we were able to make capital available to that town so that they could get their roads, or some of their roads, reopened. We also were able to make capital available to local businesses to meet payroll, recognizing that we were giving out small loans with the prospect that we might not get repaid. But as the local bank, we felt that was very important. And again, for us, not a big deal. We had a 2-hour power outage. 14 months later, Tropical Storm Sandy, not going to affect us. Everything suggests that the trajectory is going to send it into New Jersey. What can go wrong? Little did we know that the Raritan River actually has levees in places. And one of the levees was breached. And as a small bank, we can't afford our own data processing, so we contract that out. Well, the data processing center was downriver from where the levee breached, and it was destroyed. And for 10 days, we were out of business. We opened our doors every day. We had no computers. Customers were not able to determine what checks had cleared in their accounts, how much money they had in their accounts. How do they know whether or not loan payments were paid? And what was fascinating was, with Irene, everything was fine. Those customers didn't understand what's the problem. Sandy didn't come through Brattleboro. It hit New Jersey. Well, that's where our data processing center is. So while we have a great disaster recovery program, our data processing company obviously failed in ensuring that its disaster recovery and business continuity plan worked. So the other thing that we're looking at is the National Flood Insurance Program continues to get kicked down the road in short extensions by Congress. What's the risk that that program might somehow be reduced or even eliminated? The availability of capital for people to finance businesses, finance homes, is going to be largely dependent on the ability to get flood insurance. Banks will not finance properties that are in flood zones if there's no insurance available. And the other thing that we have to consider is the limits on these flood insurance policies, because all of a sudden in this day and age, $250,000 or $500,000 could be far short of what's necessary to recover from the damage of a storm like that. So with that, I will turn it over to Gretchen.
Okay, can everybody hear me? So I worked after Tropical Storm Irene in Vermont, in Windham and Lower Windsor County, door to door with businesses, actually going to their place of business and helping them with resources to either rebuild or actually end up closing. So I just kind of want to go through a couple of these photos that I have here. So this is our North Main Street. This is actually the day of the flood. In our historic district, we have 57 buildings, and 46 of them were flooded. We also, that was about 50 businesses, because some businesses, actually there's two in buildings. So, two buildings were actually taken by the flood, and they were on this street, which is West Main Street. I don't know if anybody has been, how many people have been to Wilmington? Maybe Dot's Restaurant? Yeah, there we go, there's a few of you out there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Dot's Restaurant and rebuilding. So we spent probably about 8 months trying to figure out, are we going to rebuild? And it was a challenging decision for the owners. This project actually ended up costing a little shy of $1 million. That's a lot of eggs to sell. And it was really brought by the community did not want to let this diner go. And the community stepped forward and helped fund this. We used multiple resources from historic tax credits to other funding and actually their own funds. This particular restaurant did have flood insurance. It probably would have been a much better scenario for them to actually walk away financially. But they felt an obligation to our community to rebuild. So this is the first picture here. This is the day of the flood. This is Dot's. This is going over a bridge right here on West Main Street. This picture here is right after the flood. This is the next day. This actually is during the flood. And this is actually the beginning of the rebuild, which they had to preserve in order to get the historic tax credits. They needed to preserve the building, the structure of it, to get those credits. So they had to boost it up so that it sits higher than it does without actually taking the space, keeping the space the same, because it's a very small area. And this is the rebuild of Dots. So Stevens and Associates, a architectural firm in Brattleboro, actually put the engineering together to mitigate future floods of Dots. So I'm going to note on the back end of this, which I'm sorry I don't have a picture of, is a very tall concrete wall that will stop the river coming down and avert it around the actual diner. Again, it's higher. In the basement, there is very high technology, I don't know what you call them, I guess posts or whatever, that actually sink to the bottom of the basement and then actually divert the water out if the water comes in again. So, which it will. We talk about that this tropical storm Irene was, the 100-year flood. The 100-year flood is, is not existent anymore, really. Probably in another 50 years, we could be experiencing something, if not sooner. So the town actually came up with a little motto during our flood recovery, because there's multiple stories like this, obviously, with so many businesses being flooded. Wilmington, where amazing happens. Also, I just want to go back to this photo a little bit. I have another picture, which I should have brought, of the National Guard. It's a major Route 9 pass, and just National Guard vehicles are just all over the street when we were mucking out buildings. And I have a couple takeaways. Flood insurance. The majority of these businesses did not have flood insurance. And unfortunately what they did is they went and they closed out retirement accounts or life insurance policies. They cashed in just so that they could reopen. which was really unfortunate. So again, I think, the instinct to rebuild is like immediate. Oh man, I've got to muck this out. I got to clean it up, and I got to get back in business immediately. I think the most important thing is for those businesses to actually take a deep breath, take a look, see what's available to them, what are the options, and with the hazard mitigation program, some of these could have been bought out. And then the town ends up owning that property. That could have been a better choice for businesses. They're in debt. The other thing that I just want to say is Wilmington was also on an economic decline, which was difficult before the flood, but then it compounded with the flood. And we also have a lot of aging business owners that were hoping that this would be their retirement, that they would sell their inn and restaurant, and unfortunately that wasn't true. They had to go into debt in order to rebuild and to get the money back. I was working actually with the Vermont Small Business Development Center for that year and a half, and we developed a Vermont Small Business Disaster Recovery Guide. And it was, I do have a copy of it here, but it is a step-by-step guide to help businesses when they are affected by any disaster. FEMA, what happened, a lot of businesses went to sign up at the control center, and they were pushed to the Small Business Administration table to register and to sign up for SBA loans. Unfortunately, what was happening is those businesses would go back and they would tell their neighbor, don't bother, don't go, because they're just going to offer you a loan. They have no funding for businesses to be able to reopen. And unfortunately, what happened a few months down the line, we could not substantiate a figure for the federal government to send us more funds because people didn't go and they didn't register. So I helped a lot with trying to create that figure. So eventually we were given funds to be able to help through community development block grant money. Grassroots fundraising. In Wilmington, 51% of our grant list are second homeowners because we live, it's a resort community. If we didn't have those second homeowners step up to the plate and create these amazing nonprofits to really go out and fundraise for Wilmington to rebuild, we would be in a much sadder state today. One of the nonprofits was Wilmington Fund Vermont, and they raised about $800,000. Another one was Friends of the Valley, and they raised about $500,000. So without them, it would have been really difficult for some of these businesses to reopen. Also, the Rotary Club stepped up to the plate, and they had a fund available as well. And the Vermont Community Fund helped all of Vermont recover as well. The other thing that we had, that we introduced to the taxpayers in Wilmington was a 1% local option tax. So this is an option tax that is put in place just in Wilmington. So when you purchase prepared food, when you shop retail, 1% is added to the cost of your receipt. And those funds go to the state of Vermont. They take their cut for processing, and then it comes back to the town. And we use these funds for community and economic development purposes. And that's been helpful we started a revolving loan fund where businesses could apply with very low interest rates and very flexible funds. Other things is facade improvement grants, so to help improve their signage or the front of their storefront, people have taken advantage of that too. So events funds is also used in that. And community is really important. We had a great community that came together and really volunteered, helping walking buildings out, and still help today.
Thank you both. Amazing stories, and I think there's a lot of lessons inside there that people can take away. I'm not going to ask you questions. I had some for you, which I mentioned to you in an email, but I'm going to take a few questions from the audience so we can get a couple of those in before we move to the next event. And does somebody have a microphone, or otherwise you'll just have to yell?
I don't mind speaking up. So the weight.
Say who you are.
Ed Gardner with NOAA. I work with David Herring on the climate resilience toolkit. The weight assessed decide point really struck me with Doc's Restaurant. I get the emotional attachment to the old building, and I can relate to that, but I wondered if there was some reflection on that case study or others about, maybe we build a different kind of a structure and retain this community value and service of this diner. Just wondering if you could amplify a little bit on that point.
So with Dots, it did take a long time to figure out, does this make sense? They did look at other properties, but they were still in the flood zone because it's important for them to be in the downtown. And it was agonizing, actually, because it was, yes, we're going to rebuild, no, we're not going to rebuild. And then, of course, mitigation of that, the cost was all in really mitigation. That's why it was so expensive to rebuild that. And they had a very successful business, and for them, they needed a 10-year, window to help them recover and have something to sell at the end of that. So it was painstaking, but they felt like it was really important for their identity to be in the same place. So in order to do that, they needed to mitigate the flooding in some way. So that's where the cost was in rebuilding. Does that answer your question?
Sort of, but I'll let someone else ask a question, maybe follow up.
I think too, if I can comment that Wilmington, itself, pretty much the entire downtown is in a flood zone, but it's also an historic district, and the look and feel of the town is very much important to the town's attractiveness to tourists, which, as Gretchen pointed out, is it's a tourism industry economy that we have in that part of the state. So landmarks like Dots, while it may not on the surface seem like a good idea to simply rebuild there and rebuild using part of the existing structure, it's important to retain the character of the town. So sometimes you make those decisions.
It sounds like the work that was done would be a little more resilient the next time.
Right.
It reminds me of New Orleans, which is below sea level, and we're not going to move it. So, but
There's been a lot of proposals to move the town.
let's right here.
I wonder if you could give some indication of whether or not the businesses that have now survived have bought flood insurance, and are they able to get it at a reasonable price?
Yeah, and
I can tell you that one of the changes that we made at the bank, and I think this is where banks have some responsibility, because of the flood insurance rules with FEMA. If you have a business that doesn't own its building but is operating in a flood zone, they're not required to have flood insurance for that loan. If, however, they own the building, then not only do they have to have flood insurance on the building, but on also all the contents. So we changed our policy that any business that we finance, whether they own the building in which they're located or not, we require them to have flood insurance just in case. How many people actually have gone out and purchased it, I don't know, aside from those that we've required it, because it's not inexpensive. And under the Bigger Waters Act, which is reforming, if you will, the National Flood Insurance Program, premiums are rising at a significant rate, which, again, don't build in the flood zone.
One more. Going one here, we got one here. Remember, say who you are.
My name is Christina Thompson. I work for the Nation Conservancy. I have two questions. The first one is pretty quick. So flood insurance. Are folks who are residential or commercial able to...
Give her the mic. Give her the mic.
Are folks able to figure out what their flood insurance premiums might
Give it to
be
her.
before purchasing a property, whether they're residential or commercial? And also, what role do you think lending institutions will play in in advocating for the reauthorization and perhaps reform of the National Flood Insurance Program?
So I'll do the first part here. So yes, businesses are able to contact their local insurance company and they can get a quote on the flood insurance. But it's important also for the towns to make sure that they are doing everything that they can, working with FEMA and Agency of Natural Resources to comply with anything that's going on in town so that the flood insurance is less costly.
And as to the second part of your question, we absolutely have a responsibility to advocate for continuation of the National Flood Insurance Program and its reforms. Hopefully, there's less building in flood zones. You look at Houston and how many of those homes that ended up being built in what were essentially dry reservoirs. So we can't move Wilmington, so it's there. So our responsibility as a local bank, and we're a 3-branch bank, our responsibility is to our communities. And so we need to make sure that we're continuing to be able to offer the capital that people need to buy homes, buy businesses. And part of that's going to be, is there insurance available? Is it reasonable? Will it meet the needs in the event that there is a flood?
I want to thank both of you, Dan and Gretchen, for coming today and relaying some of the experiences of Brattleboro and Wilmington. I think you highlighted a lot of the issues that come to play in a small community, emotional as well as financial. And again, resilience is more than the physical. It's also the human spirit and the human well-being, and so these things are tough to balance, and there's no price sometimes. But I appreciate what you've laid out and the work that you guys have been doing. Thank you all for the questions, and we're going to move to the next session.
Thanks for having us.
In the margins of the sessions that we've been running. Can I ask for you to join me now in focusing on the plenary panel that we're going to dive into. Again, I'm Abby Abrash-Walton. I co-direct the Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience of Antioch. And before I introduce this last plenary panel, I have the exciting task of letting the 4 winners know that they've won these gift bags from W.S. Badger and Company, which are loaded with all sorts of fun stuff. So I'm gonna just read out the names of the 4 winners. If you hear your name, you can pick up your bag at the registration desk. The first winner is Julie LaBranche. Congratulations, Julie. The next winner is our very own Sue Weller. Congratulations, Sue. The next winner is Annie Cox-Wells. Congratulations, Annie. And the last winner is Paige Nygaard. Congratulations, Paige. So again, pick these up at the registration desk. Also, just a housekeeping note, as you get ready to leave, when we conclude today at 3:30, please do give us your badges. There's a basket up at the registration desk. We do reuse these badges, so please drop them in the basket there. We'll appreciate that. And now I want to introduce the person who is going to be moderating this plenary discussion on financing and how you can find the resources that you need to do the projects that you know you want to do. Deb Markowitz is visiting professor of environmental policy and leadership at the University of Vermont's Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. Deb joined UVM following a very long career in public service. She was elected Vermont Secretary of State 6 times, serving from 1999 to 2011. And in 2011, she was appointed Secretary of the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, where she served until 2017. In her role as the Secretary of A&R in Vermont, Deb shaped the state's environmental agenda, focusing on climate change, forest health, and integrity in cleaning up Lake Champlain. She speaks nationally and internationally on state leadership in the fight against climate change, and she served on the board of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative here in the Northeast and represented Vermont on the White House Task Force on Climate Preparedness and Resilience and at the United Nations Summits on Climate Change in Paris and in Marrakesh. Deb currently serves on the boards of advisors for our center here at Antioch, also for the Georgetown Climate Center and UVM's Rubenstein School. She founded Vermont Parks Forever, the Foundation for Vermont State Parks, and also the Women's Leadership Initiative. Deb's a graduate of the University of Vermont and Georgetown University Law Center, and I learned the other night at dinner that if you want to know anything about Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you need to talk to Deb, because Deb it took the oral history from Ruth Bader Ginsburg and is like an expert on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So Kate McKinnon from Saturday Night Live should be talking with you for inside strategy. She's been recognized for her leadership by being awarded an Aspen Institute Rodel Fellowship and the Kennedy School of Government's Kahn Fellowship for Public Leadership. So please join me in welcoming Deb Markowitz to the
That was quite the introduction. But for all of you just kind of mid-career or starting out in your career, you should know that the reason why, and this is left out of my bio, the reason why I was appointed the Secretary of the Environment in Vermont is because I lost a race for governor. So it wasn't all sunshine and roses that long. And even when you lose, you could end up being the winner anyway. So it's really lovely to be here and to have this lunch panel. And when I first saw it on the agenda, I was thinking, finance after lunch? Really? Oh my God, what are they thinking? And then I thought, no, finance after lunch. Like, how many of you in the audience think about spreadsheets? Well, a bunch of you do. That's good. That's really good. How many of you really love thinking about spreadsheets? So I would say, right, so, there's three crazy people in the audience. But anyone who's ever really tried to get something done knows that if you don't have the money, you're not going to get it done. And this is actually the exact right time in this whole 3 days of workshops and presentations to be thinking about money. Because are you all jazzed up right now with ideas of things you could be doing at home, right? Let's give a round of applause actually to Antioch and the organizers. Really awesome. So your brains are all filled with ideas of things you want to do. And now you've got to actually go home and think about, well, how are you going to make it happen? And we've got a dynamic panel to talk to you about options that are working, things that they're working on for funding resilience and financing resilience at scale. So before we go to the panel, and I'll introduce them in a minute, how many of you are kind of fuzzy about funding, finance, isn't that kind of the same thing? It's like money, like how do you get money, right? So funding and finance are real different. So as somebody who ran, an agency, we had a grant program when we would give communities money and to help them fund projects. Our ecosystem restoration fund put money on the ground in multiple communities to help them put in green infrastructure to make them more resilient to storms. And people like that, right? Financing is a little trickier. So from state government, we have financing, we offer financing as well. All of those revolving loan funds. So what's the difference between funding and finance?
One you have to give up, give back, the other one.
Yes, one you get free money. Although it's not really free because of course it's the taxpayers. Well, I should remind you as a public servant, right, a prior public servant. But the other one is a loan, you have to pay it back. Sometimes it's a loan with really good terms. It's a zero interest loan or a low interest loan, but you have to pay it back. And when we think about the challenges that we're facing in our communities, in our state, and the nation, the world, right? Well, the goal is to be able to scale up solutions. And I think everyone in this room knows there's not enough funding in the world to scale up solutions. So how do we leverage other people's money, right, through financing? How do we leverage green bonds? You're going to hear about that. How are we going to leverage, sometimes there's some startup money for revolving loan funds, from EPA and other places. How do we leverage that to scale up solutions? And so we're going to hear a little bit about that right now, and I'm going to introduce our panel, starting closest to me, Anil Tripani, thank you. I forgot to ask him how to pronounce, and Markowitz, I should know better, right? So Anil is a researcher and executive associate of the Climate Bonds Initiative. He just moved back from London, where they're centered, and so this is looking at it at an international scale, which is really, I think, awesome. Then we've got Lee Epstein, Lands Program Director and Special Counsel for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and so that's regional. It's like taking a look at really quite a large area. And then John Cleveland is the Executive Director from the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, and he's the President of Innovation Network for Communities. And then finally, we've got Brandy Espinola, and she's a Resilience and Sustainability Program Manager at the Environmental Finance Center. And that's a center that she'll tell you about how it was started with EPA funding. Each of them are going to begin by just telling a little bit about themselves, if I missed something. And then they're going to answer an opening question, which is to tell us about their work on financing and how they think state and local governments can use innovating financing strategies to pay for the needed investments in adaptation and resilience is the big question. And I'd like you all to think, as you're listening to them, about how this is a partner that you could have at the table that really can help you innovate, both in developing solutions, but in scaling those solutions. So we're going to start with Anil.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? All right. It's good I checked. All right, hi everybody. My name is Anil Tripathi. I'm from the Climate Bonds Initiative, an international organization based in London focused on mobilizing the $100 trillion global bond market for climate change solutions. So talking about show me the money, this is a massive market which you can tap into. Just to kind of go over the basics, a green bond is a debt instrument, similarly to a loan, except for the fact that it can be traded within financial markets. The value of a bond is that you can tap into the $100 billion that we have globally. So at the Climate Bonds Initiative, we really work to try to mobilize the green bond market to continue its growth. I think the slides might have gone a bit out of order, actually.
Let's see.
Here we go. So, starting with the history of this market, Green bonds started in 2007 with the European Investment Bank issuing the first green bonds, followed shortly afterwards by the World Bank. In the United States, the green bond market started with Massachusetts issuing the first green bonds in 2013. And since then, the market has had tremendous growth. So going back to a green bond, exactly like a regular bond in terms of its financial structure, except for the added component that the projects financed by this bond have to demonstrate that there is environmental value in terms of the impact of its project. And so this simple coupling, right, the idea of a bond with a pre-existing market globally, and the idea that we wanted to use these bonds to finance more environmentally friendly projects has led to tremendous growth. So from those early beginnings in 2007, 2008, we had $160.3 billion in green bonds issued last year. So we've had almost exponential growth in this sector. And as you can see in the growth, local government green bond issuances has continued to climb over the years since Massachusetts' first municipal green bond issuance in 2013. And in 2018, we're thinking about seeing approximately $250 billion in issuance globally. And so in terms of the infrastructure classes that are being financed with green bonds, renewable energy, as you may expect, has always been a large feature of this market. Followed by low carbon billings, clean transport, water infrastructure, lots of different sectors, which I'm sure all of you are very much involved in here. And so in terms of how this market's developed in the municipal space, so going back to our panel question of how state and local governments can tap into innovative financing solutions, in the green bond market, you have entities ranging from state governments to particular bodies such as Massachusetts Water Resources Authority and others that have been tapping into the green bond market by issuing green bonds and receiving benefits such as investor diversification because of the large sovereign wealth funds and other investors that increasingly have sustainability mandates. They're on the lookout to buy green bonds. And so, for instance, when the state of Massachusetts issued green bonds, they had new investors coming in that had never bought the state's bonds. And so this real demand for this instrument is, in many cases, translating into a lower cost of capital. And so that is one of the main benefits that you can get through getting into this market. So I think, in the sense of giving you the broad overview of what's been happening with green bonds, you have tremendous growth in this sector, and it's been particularly active in the United States within the municipal market. There are some things that you have to think about if you're wondering whether your project could be connected with a potential green bond issuance. One is, can the entities that you're dealing with, whether it be a local government or a corporation perhaps, can they already issue a bond? Because if they can already do that, they can fairly easily get into issuing a green bond as well. But then, of course, you want to think about whether the costs in putting together a bond issuance makes sense for the project you're doing, or if there are other forms of financing, such as loans available at the state level that you would rather look into. So I believe my fellow panelists, Lee and Brand, you're going to be looking closely into these issues as well. Once again, in the Climate Bonds Initiative, we're very much focused in terms of providing education on how you can get into this market and tap into the potential of green bonds to finance the projects you're involved in. Feel free to reach out.
Before we move on to Lee, let me just say that green bonds, this is a fairly new instrument, and there is tremendous potential. And when I was meeting the panelists in advance of coming up here, and Neil had talked about how his background is actually not finance, it was anthropology, and then his professor said, but the future is going to be in green bonds. And so he took a break from his PhD to go and do this work. And it is nationally, internationally, the conversation is all about, can we finance at scale bringing in private money. And this is really, there's an opportunity here. And so many of you are coming from communities or state government that has the capacity to issue bonds. But your treasurers, the people making these decisions, might be a little anxious about it because it's a new market. So think about if you've got any specific questions to dive into this with Anil, as we'll open up at the end with questions. So yes, Lee, thank you.
I'm going to stand up, that's all right, so I can see my own slides. Hello, is this on? Well, hi, everybody. I only have about 40 slides, so I'll probably be here till about 4. No problem with that, I'm sure. The reason why this kind of an instrument might make some sense is that the nation is going through the greatest transfer of wealth from the older generation to the millennials that has ever happened in this country. And an awful lot of the younger investors care about the impacts of what they are investing in. And that's what this kind of a bond, or this kind of a loan, it can be a bond or a loan, is all about. It's about achieving particular impacts. So let me just go through my 40 slides. Just kidding. Okay. By the way, I'm Lee Epstein. I'm with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. We are a large regional advocacy organization headquartered in Annapolis, Maryland. We cover the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is 64,000 square miles and 6 states and the District of Columbia. We have offices in Maryland and Virginia, Pennsylvania. And the issue, one of the big issues for our local jurisdictions is they have to satisfy some very costly permits and some very costly regulations as part of what the Chesapeake Bay is going through right now. About 10 years ago, EPA imposed a total maximum daily load, or developed one rather, for the Chesapeake Bay, which basically is a modeled thing that just says how much pollution the bay can absorb. And that's then parceled out to those states, those jurisdictions that are part of the watershed. And they have to achieve those pollution reductions. And that occurs through permits. Municipalities, as some of you already know, have stormwater permits. And they are increasingly stringent in the Chesapeake Bay region. So the challenge is how can they implement these permits? How can they put in the kind of infrastructure, green infrastructure, which is the kind that we want to see, in a fiscally responsible way? And how can they finance it? How can they fund it? And so we have a project going where we want to try to model this new kind of instrument and see if it can work in small to mid-sized cities as well as larger cities. Of course, the kinds of infrastructure that we're talking about is also beneficial for climate resilience. The project is in 3 states. The approach of an impact bond is called pay for success. So the payment to the bondholders is related to whether the impacts, is related to whether the objectives are achieved. And I'll go through that in a second. We have a partner, Quantified Ventures, which was part of the original, the first EIB ever issued in the United States for the city of Washington, D.C. for the Sewer and Water Authority. So this is the way it works. We and our partner, Quantified Ventures, work with a city, and we help them realize the kinds of objectives they want to see. What outcomes do they want to see from the implementation of these from the use of these bonds? Put together a structure and a bond issuance. Send it out to the investors. Investors who are interested in impact bonds, again, this is a special kind of bond, put the money in, send it to those municipalities, so we're over there, public entity or partner, who do the implementation, put the infrastructure in, and then there's an independent evaluator, an independent validator, if you will, that measures the impact after the course of a certain number of years. The payback to the investors varies on how successful the project is. That's what pay for success is. So, in the first project ever done in Washington, D.C., they were piloting green infrastructure to meet some of their combined sewer issues. They needed to reduce the volume of the water going into the sewer system. They got the approval of the EPA to substitute 365 acres of green infrastructure for what otherwise would have been a huge tunnel, one of 3, under the city to hold that water. But they didn't know whether that 365 acres would actually work. And here's the value of an impact bond. You can use it to pilot something. You can use it to decide if what you want to do can be scaled up and should be scaled up, whether it's cost efficient to do that. So they're piloting 20 acres of green infrastructure at a cost, a very high cost actually, of $25 million. And the investors are paid back variously, depending on how well that infrastructure performs. So if it performs as it's expected, they get a pretty good return. Basically, the kind of return you get on a municipal bond. Same, vanilla municipal bond. If it performs better, they get a little bit more return. But the district doesn't mind giving them that. The Water and Sewer Authority doesn't mind giving them that because they know that that infrastructure works, that they can then go on and do it across the city. If it underperforms, if it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, then the investors get less. And there's a clawback provision. They actually give money back to DC Water, $3 million. So they know, DC Water knows, okay, that's not really working that well. We get some money back and we go in and we do it the old-fashioned way. So that's the way that one works. It's the only one that's been done so far, so that's kind of a model, but there are any number of ways of doing it. And that's pretty much what an EIB is.
Thank you. For folks in the audience who are new to thinking about financing, there have traditionally been 2 kinds of bonds, and this adds a third element. So general obligation bonds are bonds where you're going to be paid back because you're going to be paid back because it's a taxing authority. And with a few exceptions where there have been bankruptcies, that's very unusual, and then the state's taking over the obligations, you're going to get paid back. Like you're an investor. It's a general obligation bond, can be a municipality. Corporations also can issue, in some cases, general obligation bonds. And then you may be more familiar with revenue bonds. Revenue bonds are the kind of financing you might do if you want to do an upgrade to your sewer system and you want to spend it now, and you're going to be charging sewer fees over time. So it's backed up by that particular revenue stream. That's why it's a revenue bond versus general, which is the general fund will back it up. Performance bonds are really innovative, and the beginning idea, it came about through energy efficiency, actually. And you can see how that makes sense, right? You have a regular bill, you know what it's going to be, and so you can do a bond and pay it off based on the savings in your energy. And I would suggest that the pilot project in Washington, D.C. could be a real game changer. It's very, very impressive. And they are demonstrating that there are investors willing to take that risk, the risk of success of the project. It's a unique investor though, right? So, and maybe we can hear more about those challenges in the Q&A section. Now, John.
Great. Well, good afternoon. It's actually delightful to be in a room where that many people raised their hands when they were asked about spreadsheets. It's great to be here. And I have 2 roles here. I lead a small nonprofit called the Innovation Network for Communities that for the last decade has been working with cities on their climate strategies, a combination of mitigation and adaptation. We've been close partners with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network since its founding. We helped launch the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, which is 24 global cities targeting carbon neutrality by 2050, and we work really closely with C40 and with most of the philanthropy world that invests in climate change. Last year, we issued a report on adaptation in cities, adaptation planning and implementation in cities. We're looking at implementation, not the planning. What does it take for cities to actually implement these strategies? And there were like 8 fundamentally sort of new capacities cities have to develop, and of course financing was one of the big parts of it. And we're now doing a follow-on study funded by Kresge and Summit on thinking about what does it look like to put urban adaptation finance systems in place. The second role I have is I staff a thing in Boston called the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, which is a CEO network supporting the implementation of the city's climate action plans, 36 CEOs. We really led the city's climate resilience initiative. We did the design on it. We raised $1 million for it. We hired the project managers, and that led to the release of a report that's on the Boston website called Climate Ready Boston, 400 pages. Did a detailed vulnerability analysis for the city to set up 11 strategies and 39 initiatives. And as part of that, the follow-on to that, we commissioned a report by UMass on finance options, specifically for Boston. I don't know, is Rebecca Hurst here? Some of you may have known Rebecca with the Sustainable Solutions Lab. It's a great report. It's about 76 pages long, and it really goes into some detail. So I want to talk just a little bit about this from a municipality point of view, sort of the city point of view, and just to give you a quick snippet on what's at stake for the city of Boston, just around sea level rise and coastal flooding. By 2100, pretty modest, 3 feet of sea level rise. We lose 25% of the core downtown commercial areas of the city every day at high tide. So, if you think about that, there really isn't an option not to invest. And we're now at the stage where we've done enough of the resilience-based planning. We have an idea about what the bill is going to look like, probably something in the $2 to $4 billion range. So now they're just at the stage of, well, how do we finance this? And who makes the decisions about that? And I'll tell you, they haven't figured that out yet. And I think one of the answers is, to the slide that's up there, is it really takes a system. It's not just about, do I have a green bond, do I have an impact bond, do I have this? You really have to have a system, and it's got at least these 4 elements. So one, you need to have the analytics at the front end, good data analytics, good climate forecast. Paul Pershing, he and Ellen Douglas led our science team that did the forecast, developed really detailed maps of what kind of flooding would occur under what circumstances, both from precipitation and from coastal. You need way better hydrology analysis about where the water's going to go and how it's going to flow. Most of you know the Back Bay. It's pretty low. A third of Boston is infill. It was built a foot above sea level. Actually, the way the water gets to the Back Bay is not up the Charles River, as it turns out. It comes through the Seaport District, goes around and goes through the Mass Pike and enters the Back Bay through the back. Well, we're just starting to understand that. You need those kinds of analytics that can translate the risks into vulnerability. The second thing you need a way of developing a portfolio of actual projects. What is the list of things that we are going to fund? And you need a way of taking those projects from interesting conceptual design to construction drawings, to actual implementation, and to operations and maintenance. And as part of that, which again is something we don't have in the city of Boston, is you need standardized cost-benefit analysis to decide which things you're going to fund and which things you're not going to fund. Third, you need new governance structures. And I think as we get into this discussion, I'd say this is the thorniest problem in Boston. This is nobody's job currently. It's sort of everybody's job, but it's really nobody's job. We need to do some re-engineering, and we also need to create some new institutions. And then you do need a nice portfolio of financial tools and instruments that you can bring into this process. On that, the one thing I would say is the vast majority of what has to be funded does not generate a revenue stream by the project. This is not like energy efficiency, it's not like clean energy. So in most cases, somebody's going to have to pay for this, and it's either going to be the general taxpayers or it's going to be people who benefit from it. It's a new cost of doing business that we just have to suck it up and realize we have. And if you think about a city of Boston with $100 billion of asset valuation currently, $3 billion over 30 or 40 years is not that much money. But we haven't yet gotten really to the point of accepting that this is a new public function that needs to happen. So when we get to the discussion, I think we'll want to get into what does it take to build a system like this in a municipality. And on the little box on the right hand, it's not good enough to have it at a municipal scale. You actually have to have it at the district, municipal, regional scale, because there are a lot of municipalities in Metro Boston that don't have the resources to do what Boston did, and at the Commonwealth, at the state scale, and those things all need to be synchronized. And that's a big challenge.
So one of the most important points I think John just made was that we're in a point of change where our municipal leaders don't always believe that this is part of their job. Even worse, the public doesn't always understand that this is part of the job of the new reality for municipalities. And Boston's been a real leader, in part because the mayor wanted to lead on this and had staff that really cared about it, and then people in the business community who really stepped up and demanded action. So it's that combination of, for all of you who may have gone to any sessions about communication, that's what this communication is all about. It's like leading to building the capacity within your areas of authority, your communities, so that there's an understanding that this is a new reality. We need to expect our governmental entities to think long-term about how they're going to keep us safe and keep our assets protected. Brandy, now on the micro level, right?
So thank you, Deb. I know when I was first asked to be a presenter on this panel, I was a little intimidated because the gentlemen alongside with me have been doing some really innovative and big thinking things. And I work with a lot of really small municipalities. I work at the Environmental Finance Center at the University of Maryland. It's one of 10 centers that the EPA established about 25 years ago across the country. And we were established really to help local municipalities figure out how they were going to pay for their environmental initiatives. And it's becoming an even more increasingly important thing for us to help communities figure out. I work specifically in the state of Maryland, and in Maryland, about 85% of the municipalities are under 10,000, and about 39% are under 1,000, that's the population. And so I'm talking about really small municipalities that might not be able to plug into these larger, innovative green bond programs. And so when we talk about financing at that scale, oftentimes it looks a lot more like technical assistance and capacity building, making sure that they get through that pipeline that John was talking about, making sure that they have the good technical assistance at developing those impact assessments and then thinking through the projects. So for a small municipality, when we're trying to figure out how do you finance and how do you fund your programs and your resilience, it's about adopting a mix of strategies. And so right now we're working at the Environmental Finance Center to really figure out how to integrate our planning. We're working with the Department of Natural Resources at the state of Maryland and working on a pilot project with the city of Annapolis and the city of Salisbury, really to think about what are the plans that they already have in place and what are the resilience strategies that we can pull out of that to really start thinking about how do we find those projects specifically in some sort of bundle. Another thing that we're doing on this particular project is really thinking through what are the state level funding mechanisms and financing mechanisms that already exist, and how do we wrap that up into some sort of guidance document so that the small communities can really plug into that quickly. Because oftentimes, even if you know what sort of projects you want to fund, if you're a small community, you don't even really know where to begin thinking about which types of financing and funding mechanisms would be the best, most appropriate venue for partnering out with a particular project. The next thing that we're doing is we're working with the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy about thinking about how to embed resilience into current processes like your capital improvement planning process. And so we're working with the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy really to look at who out there in the country is already doing this. Places like Miami-Dade County, places like Boston who've already started to think about these things and put together some guidance documents for our smaller communities to figure out how to easily start thinking about integrating this into their capital improvement plans and how to really, what are the steps that they're going to need to take. We're also looking at how to embed these sort of resilience projects into your general budgeting process. We're looking at this point at the city of New Orleans, who's one of the 100 resilient cities, and trying to borrow from them their strategy. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the city of New Orleans, for the 100 Resilient Cities program, has really committed to putting resilience into their general budgeting process. And one of the ways that they're doing that is thinking about what are the questions that folks need to be asking themselves as they're developing their general budgets. So for example, now whenever an agency at the City of New Orleans puts forward a budget, they need to think about and address how is this particular project going to benefit the community 25 years into the future? How does a particular project actually integrate with other agency department programs and projects? And really, how does this have co-benefits both from an environmental standpoint, but also from a social and economic standpoint? And so simply by integrating that and thinking about that during your general budgeting process across all your agencies and departments can help a small community build in these financing of resilience into their current processes. And then last, really, as John mentioned, thinking about bundling projects together. So a lot of the small municipalities are too small. The scale at which they're doing this work really does not scale up to the financing mechanisms that were discussed here today. So thinking about how do you bundle these projects perhaps across a region? If you have neighboring municipalities, can you bundle with them in order to move a larger group of projects forward? Or how do you bundle various projects across sectors within your own jurisdiction to maybe appeal to the private sector? A great example of a community that's done this is Newport, Rhode Island. Is there anyone here from Newport, Rhode Island? Man. Well, then I guess you can correct me if I'm wrong. I was hoping nobody was here today. But so from my understanding, what you all did out there, you work with your economic development personnel. Paul Carroll really helped you think through a portfolio of projects across various sectors. So this was microgrids, this was urban agriculture, this was developing economic hubs and thinking about their security issues. And then they put out this bundle of projects, I think it was 30 plus projects out for a general RFP. And they received a response from a consortium. It was an engineering firm, a construction company, and 2 investment firms who said, okay, we'll go ahead and take on these projects, some of which might not have a great return on investment, but because they're bundled with other projects, then we can actually really move this forward. So we're hoping to borrow from the work that Newport has done in terms of bundling projects across sectors with some of our smaller municipalities in Maryland to see whether that's an effective mechanism really for moving things forward. And so really, even if we're small, even if your municipality is small, there are things that you can start thinking about now to make sure that you have sound fiscal planning processes in place and embedding that within the processes that you've already come to become experts in.
Thank you. So of note from what Brandy was talking about is that we're already putting billions of dollars on the ground in infrastructure every year, like across this region. And how do we leverage that and bundle it in a way that really helps us reach our resilience goals? For all of you in state government, think about how do you require municipalities to consider resilience before you give money. I know after Irene, we made the decision that no dollar was going to be invested in Vermont unless they had a resilience plan around it, unless it was part of a resilience plan. And in some cases, we did have to rebuild roads where we know they're going to be washed out. But in doing so, we said, and you need to plan so the next time it washes out, we're not going to rebuild it in the same place. So, that's a great starting point. What I'm curious about from Brandy, working with these small communities, is there a way to help them leverage private financing? Like, what are the barriers? What support do you think they could use? Or is it just impossible and they should be focused on the traditional financial, revolving loan funds and so forth?
Sure. So from a small municipality perspective, I think one thing that the state and local governments can do to help those smaller municipalities is really thinking about how to build their capacity and how to maybe scale the projects. So again, thinking about bundling those projects together either at a regional level or trying to figure out how do you create bundles of projects across sectors within your own jurisdiction. I think that's one of the things that we can really do to help bring in the private sector who's really looking for that ROI, so they're looking for projects at scale. So thinking, I guess, regionally is number one thing that I think we can do to help small municipalities.
And do they need technical assistance beyond what you're seeing or able to provide? And do you have a sense of where that could come from?
Yeah, well, so actually something that I heard about today, or this week, was Massachusetts seems to be doing a really great job at sort of building the capacity of their local municipalities by providing training, and then on top of the training and capacity building, providing actual state level funding that can then be used to leverage private funding.
That's great. So thinking about how you build these cross-sector partnerships, and maybe Lee can build on that. Like one of the challenges we've seen is for cities, not just even the small communities, they want to, oftentimes they're looking for opportunities to combine funding streams to pay for multi-benefit projects. Like something small in Vermont is we use transportation funds to do invasive eradication project on our stream banks because the invasive knotweed creates more erosion, which will impact the road. So we combine funding streams. So we had street funding for volunteers, we had the transportation funding. That's not always easy to do. Are there funding mechanisms that are needed to help cities and states pay for these sort of multi-benefit projects? Because our idea is that we don't, we want to look for multiple benefits in every dollar that we spread, right?
No, there are. There definitely are. There definitely are multiple streams. In fact, the first city that we're working with is intending to issue a $6.2 million EIB and then use $10 million from the state's revolving loan fund to backfill those projects. They're going to be putting 90 some small best management practices in the ground all around the city. And the best way that they've come up with to fund that initially is through this combination of mechanisms. I did want to mention, with respect to the smaller communities, we don't have yet communities in Pennsylvania as part of this project, but we're working to get them. And as some of you know, Pennsylvania is a compilation of 2,700 fiefdoms, known as local government. And some of them are tiny, most of them are very rural. They have little tiny towns in them. These are townships, but with small towns. So we're facing the same issue that was just brought up. And again, the way we're going about it is we're trying to approach them in a kind of a regional way so that they can bundle their projects together. So we get maybe 5 townships working together. Some of them may already have a consortium to do that. To meet their stormwater permit needs, and some of them might not, but that's absolutely one way to do it, is to bring them together over.
Thank you. And John, on a slightly different note, as you were talking about this sort of comprehensive approach you're taking in the city of Boston, where there'll be a variety of funding required, different kinds of financing required. I'm wondering if you are experiencing any anxiety among the business community or other communities about funding through user fees, or what it's going to cost them to pay back, and is there an equity issue? How are you managing that as you're looking comprehensively at what has to happen to transform Boston?
Well, the good news is that the business leaders in Boston are really happy to pay any user fee you ask them to.
Yeah, and you all, you can relate, right?
Yeah, I think that, again, this is an area that where sort of the social contract hasn't been evolved yet, which is not only you got to know what is it we need to do and how much does it cost. You have to have an idea about how you pay for it, but then the question of who pays for it. I mean, what's the division of responsibility between the property owners who get direct benefit? Let's say in the Seaport District where we're going to be building coastal berms, right? So to what extent, what share of that should those real estate players pay? What should be paid by the city? Because if the Seaport goes down, there's 60,000 jobs in the Seaport where people live in other parts of the city, so people in other parts of the city ought to be paying for it too. But the economy of the city of Boston is also really important to the Commonwealth. The metro region is something on order of 60 to 70% of the state economy. So shouldn't the Commonwealth also be contributing some? And I think we just don't have that social agreement worked out yet. You look in transportation, and while it's fractious, we know that MBTA was doing a presentation on how they're building resilience into their capital outlay plan. They do a 5-year capital outlay plan. They have 15 different funding sources. Well, they know all those funding sources. They've done, some of them are federal, some of them are state, some of them are fees they charge, and some of them are local. Well, it's kind of a known entity, and the relative responsibility is kind of agreed to, and I don't think that contract has really been made yet, and it's gonna have to be organized. On the equity issue, I think there's an additional question, which is not just who pays and how is that fair, but two other questions. One, how do you decide what to protect? So you've got a wealthy downtown business district with billions of dollars of commercial real estate, and you've got a neighborhood which is triple deckers. Like, where do you go? Where do you put the money? I don't think we have clarity about that. And then last, if in fact the scale of increase, and we don't actually know this is the case yet, is high enough in any fee that it actually represents an economic burden, particularly for low and moderate income households. How do you mitigate that? But the fee question, this is why the Excel spreadsheets matter, right? The devil is totally in the detail. You have to know the volume of projects, and you have to know the asset base you're amortizing it over. You have to have some idea about the cost of capital, and you have to have some idea about the term. And if you have that data, then you can run the numbers and you can have an idea. In general, I think in Boston, there's a little bit more of a bias towards funding things through things like water fees, because everybody in the city pays water fees. If you shift it to property taxes, don't forget, there's a whole bunch of, I think in Boston, 40% of the property owners don't pay property taxes because they're nonprofits. So you have a very different allocation of the costs, and I think we really need to dive into the detail of that and figure out what that formula is, so we can just be standardized on it. We don't have to make it up with every new project we do.
Thank you, and that kind of leads right to Emil. Is there a role for the private financial market with all of this? And are there things that, is the market sort of nimble enough to be responsive to what local government needs? And are there things that local and state government should be doing differently in order to take advantage of the opportunities presented by the private financial sector?
Yeah, so I think, from what we've been hearing, of course, at the local level, all of us are already involved in so much work to document and assess the sustainability projects that we're involved in. And in terms of what investors in markets such as the green bond market are thinking of, in a sense, they don't have the expertise themselves, right, to really know fully and to be able to evaluate whether the projects that a green bond is attached to is going to have a positive environmental impact. That's why at Climate Bonds we've really worked to try to standardize green bond frameworks, which municipalities can use to bring in the information that they have about the sustainability projects they're involved in. So that's laid out fairly straightforwardly for the investors. So I think it's important to understand that from the investor side, They just want to make sure that the information is accessible to them in a fairly straightforward and clear format. And so I think, given that our audience here today, you're all involved in really kind of the nitty-gritty and the details of the projects that these investors are looking to get into but don't fully understand, what they're looking from this community is just kind of a straightforward overview of the projects that we're involved in.
And it can be pretty complicated, right? And so one of the things that I learned from this conference is there was a great presentation by the team from NOAA, and they helped us walk through an adaptation planning process. And I've been doing this stuff a long time, but the piece that was missing in my mind is being very intentional about who your team is, who you're bringing around the table, and by the way, is it including the person who's thinking about finance? Because I would bet that most of you here who are working in municipal government or state government are not the person who's managing the finances or is thinking about investments and how you actually financially manage to accomplish the goals. And that's a missing link, an important missing link, because nothing's going to happen without the money. And so maybe back to Brandy, we'll start with the smallest. Who is the person? Like, do you deal with the people who are in charge of managing the finances? Do we need to have different structures in our local governments in particular to make sure that we're bringing those people in early as part of the team? And do you think that knowing them is even possible?
I feel like that was a three-part question, so I'll try my best to answer that. So who's responsible for those decisions? And I think currently, it's the financiers of our municipalities, the city managers, those are responsible for the budget. But I think the better question is who should be responsible? And I think New Orleans is doing a great job of thinking about how to integrate across various agencies and how to really think about resilience as everybody's responsibility. So I think rather than developing new structures or new mechanisms, what we really just need to do is embed resilience within the processes we already have in place. Because developing a new structure would maybe just create another silo as opposed to breaking down those silos by making it everyone's responsibility. Knowing whoever's managing your budget, maybe it's your city manager, maybe you have an actual finance person on the team, having them be at all these resilience discussions or at least giving them updates on a regular basis, I think is very important.
And I guess one of the, like to build on that, also very often missing from the teams is the philanthropic community. And I'm wondering if, Lee, you've had experience, because you are really taking a comprehensive approach, and it sounds like you're bringing philanthropy along. And how does that work, and how do you find the right people?
Yeah, no, it's crucial. And in fact, it's crucial in two ways for our project. One is that this is a grant-funded project for us and for our partners, Quantified Ventures. So we've brought in a couple of big grants to allow us to provide these services to up to four municipalities at no fee, at no cost. And it took some pretty present and far-seeing foundations and people to realize that this could be an important tool and to provide that funding to us to allow us to do this work. At the same time, there is a role for philanthropy in actually the investment side. In the DC water environmental impact bond, the investors were Goldman Sachs and Calvert Foundation. And I don't know what the proportion of investment was for this bond, but philanthropy can be very important. They can be a backup, and they can make a bond that may be a little bit strange to people. They can back it up and provide that extra guarantee and bring more investors into the fold. So yeah, that's really important.
And then maybe to build on that, Anil, the whole, well, bonding itself seems very complicated, right? You're creating a financial instrument, there's a lot of regulation, that green bonds has an overlay. Can small or medium-sized communities play in this area? Is it just too technical? As a practical matter, let's say you've got Manchester wants to get involved in a green bond, it's a sort of a mid-sized city or a small city, I guess. It's a huge city compared to Vermont, but on city scales, a small city, or a medium-sized town. What would they need to do? How do they even figure out what the interest rate's going to be? How do you get started?
So I think we actually have a really large opportunity with green bonds, particularly in the United States, given a lot of the characteristics of how the municipal bond market is already working, and that you do have a large array of smaller issuances. So for instance, there was an $11.3 million green bond issued out of the city of Lawrence in Kansas. So a smaller issuance is possible. Of course, you do get a larger benefit if you're doing an issuance of a greater size, of maybe around $50 to $100 million. In terms of the price benefit that green bond issuers are receiving, it seems to be around a couple of basis points. So that really kind of impacts the benefit that you get based on the size of the issuance. So in terms of the additional costs they have to do putting together a green bond, I think it's important for smaller issuers to see what types of reporting they're already doing on the sustainability projects they're involved in, and how much effort it would take them to bring those together into a green bonds framework. So basically what investors want to see in terms of a framework relates back to the green bond principles that were established in 2014, which laid out that a framework should include the use of proceeds. So what projects are going to be financed by the green bond, the process of project selection. So why were these projects chosen to be financed by the green bond? What are the particular environmental benefits that we're seeing here? Also the management of proceeds. So investors want to know exactly how the funds are being held in relation to the project. And then the fourth part of the green bond principles is that we want to see continued reporting to investors about how these projects are developing. So that's a couple of points, but you can imagine that a lot of these aspects of a project are already being dealt with at the municipal level, right? When you're just planning a project, thinking about how it's going to be developed, how you're going to assess it over time. So another thing that's really kind of mainstream practice with green bonds is getting a second party opinion. So getting an environmental consulting firm, whether it be First Environment, KPMG, Sustainalytics, to assess the projects that are being connected to the green bond and the green bond framework that an issuer puts forth. That's kind of to give investors assurance that these projects are actually going to go through and that they've been verified by an external party. So those are, in a sense, the extra steps that go into putting together a green bond issuance, and the costs within those assessments can range between $10,000 to $40,000. So that again relates back to how the benefit that you'll get to cover those costs really can vary on the size of the issuance, but a smaller issuance is possible.
So it sounds like you first have to have a good vision of sort of the cluster of projects that you want to fund, that you want to come in with a big idea, that this isn't to fund lots of individual. You wouldn't do individual green bond issuances for lots of small projects. It's having some sort of comprehensive plan that you're then funding.
Yeah, and we actually have found that green bond, issuing a green bond has helped municipalities and corporations as well in many cases for internal due diligence. And also bringing together different departments that are not communicating to each other otherwise. And we've already heard about the difficulties of bringing in the finance people within a municipality to talk to those putting together sustainability projects. And a green bond is one thing that, you know, if you're a sustainability consultant or involved in projects, you can go to the finance office in the municipality, tell them about how a green bond could be issued off the projects you're involved in. And that's something that they could get very excited about, because green bond issuers are getting a lot of press that you don't get for regular bond issuance. So it's an opportunity to connect communities together, you know, for the financiers and those involved in sustainability.
Just kind of add to that, there are also there are social and economic benefits that come from some of these projects, and that's not a minor issue. The first city that we're working in is the city of Baltimore, and they're very interested in how these projects affect underserved communities, underserved neighborhoods. And we're hoping to be able to measure some of those co-benefits as well.
That's great. So, John, it seems to me that in your planning, as you're looking at all of the different sectors, have you been thinking at all about sort of the regional collaboration, regional coordination, and whether or not some of the solutions that are necessary will need to be scaled by having more of a regional approach?
Yeah, and most of you know, New England is generally a small box governance, region, what they call it. There's really nothing between the municipality and the Commonwealth. Other parts of the country where it's different, where counties really play a significant role, run a lot of services, have multi-billion-dollar budgets. In Florida, they have, the water management districts that do this. New England really doesn't have a lot of metro-scale infrastructure, and we're absolutely going to need it for this. I think it's, we can do a lot of interesting pilot projects at the city level, whether you're large or small. We cannot solve this problem at the municipal level. You have to have state level funding and infrastructure resources into it, and you have to have state level planning be part of it. And a lot of the projects, if you look at any of the shoreline projects in Boston, you have to think about the whole harbor. You can't just think about the city of Boston. And the question is, whose job is it, to do that? Again, to ask that question. And right now, it's like nobody's job. So you're either going to have to do what the Dutch did, where they created the Delta Commission, which is a brand new entity at the federal level that, in essence, has responsibility for coastal protection. Or you have to take an existing entity and re-engineer it. So, in Massachusetts, you could give the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority the mandate to actually worry about coastal water issues, not just water supply. But the point is that hasn't been done yet, and the scale of investment that is required is going to require new funding and new institutions, and the quicker we get over I just like to say that climate adaptation is the process of accelerating the rate at which leaders go through the Kubler-Ross death and dying stages, right? Get over the denial, over the anger, out of the bargaining. It's not going to be so bad as we thought. Stop getting so depressed that it's too big, and get on to acceptance and start working on it. It's not like this is that impossible. Boston, we spent $22 billion putting one highway underground. It's called the Big Dig. Now, a lot of you paid for it because it came out of federal taxpayer money. We spent $4.5 billion, at least, probably more like $6, cleaning up our harbor. It's now one of the cleanest harbors in the country. So it's not like we haven't done big infrastructure projects. We should just get on with it and realize that this is part of reality of life. And the real key is, are you going to get into a vicious cycle or a virtuous cycle? And the vicious cycle is you don't make the investments. As a result, your property values drop. You have less revenue. It's politically more difficult to make the investments. More bad things happen. Property values drop, and you go into a cycle down, as opposed to you get ahead of it, you make the right investments, you create investor confidence, you maintain or increase your property values, which means you have more money to actually invest. That's really the key. And the quicker we move into accepting that this is a thing that we have to do, if we want anything like the existing economic vitality, the faster those things will happen. but you can't do it just at the municipal level.
So I hope you all took notes, and isn't that a perfect message to take home to you wherever you work? I have to say that when I was Secretary of P&R, we really made a real attempt to create coordination among the northeastern states around resilience. And there's a Governors Association, the Northeast Governors Association, aptly named, and the environmental commissioners and secretaries, we had our parallel organization, and we got some grant money to look at this. What would it take to have a regional focus on climate resilience? And you might notice that you don't know about this, right? And that's because after a year and a half of trying, every state has their own thing going, and couldn't see how playing across state lines would help advance what they were trying to accomplish. We did get a few things done, in that we were able to identify some critical systems that needed protecting, critical infrastructure, including how food moves through the food and fuel move through the region. So because it all comes from, there's this one huge warehouse, I guess, in Massachusetts, and that if that goes, then we're all hungry in New England. And so there was something good that did come out of it, but there will be an institutional resistance, and it will take all of you managing up to try to help people understand that their job has changed. But this might be a good time for your questions. Isn't it a fantastic panel? Surprising, like hardly anything left. It's surprisingly fascinating. Thank you. Any questions? And if you could stand up, that might be helpful. Yes.
Sure. Thank you. This has been a great panel, and I'm sure I don't understand half of it, but thank you all for starting the conversation. We've heard a bunch this week about the bond rating agencies starting to take a look at local vulnerability and attempts to be resilient, and how that might influence the rating assignments that they make for communities. How do we avoid getting the situation where community rating scores are impacting their ability to get the green bonds, and thereby starting a vicious cycle where they can't get funding to do projects because of their ratings?
So what he's referring to is Moody's announcement that they were going to take into account, as they're giving you a bond rating or a community bond rating, whether or not you are vulnerable and have done the planning, resilience planning for your communities. And this could be the game changer, right? When the insurance companies and the bond rating companies included, and you get a better interest rate the higher the score you have with Moody's and these other bond rating agencies. And so this is important because it's saying, hey, we're going to take points off. So you're not going to get such a favorable interest rate if you haven't done the work. And that's because these are general obligation bonds. So we think that you've got more vulnerability, so maybe you're not going to be able to repay us. That you're going to go bankrupt. You're not going to have the money to pay us back on this bond. So communities are always very worried about ratings.
That's a great question. And yeah, I understand it might be concerning, I think, to municipalities that might get downgraded. I would almost see that as an opportunity to actually convince them that now is the time to try to put together a green bond deal. There have been a number of institutions already looking at, in a sense, kind of the idea of a green halo effect from a green bond issuer. So by the idea that by issuing a green bond, you're signaling for all of your investments that as a municipality or even as a corporation, you're taking climate risk seriously and taking action on them. So there have been studies looking at once a green bond issuance occurs, if all of the debt issued by that entity is affected positively as well. At Climate Bonds Initiative, Moody's is a partner of ours, as well as S&P. So we're working quite closely with them. It's interesting, I mean, in terms of their rating agencies, and then the other side of them that are involved in kind of consulting and looking at putting together bond issuances. Sometimes you have parts of the company that are a bit disconnected. But I think in a sense, this is a good opportunity to use the discussions that Moody's is putting forth with regards to climate risk impacting its ratings for people to really looking at how they can put together a green bond issuance, or just within their bond issuances, having a clear overview of how they're taking climate risk into account.
I agree with you. I think this is great because this is part of the whole process of sending pricing signals that accurately price risk. And a big part of the resilience market and finance is that right now risk is not appropriately priced. And bond ratings is one way of doing that, but there are other ways of doing that. Insurance is another way. You've got the NFIP, $25 billion in debt. We all know about that. Never going to get paid back. And you've got insurance rates that just do not reflect. They don't reflect the negative, and they also don't reflect the positive. If you really make investments in your property and make it more resilient, you don't get any benefit from that. You look at the housing valuation process, you look at disclosure in the real estate transactions, none of them are appropriately pricing risk. And when risk gets appropriately priced, that's when private markets will bring capital to the problem. Now, the risk, of course, is capital will also flee if it's not, if the risk is priced and you're not doing anything about it, capital will flee. But that's a good thing about markets. So I think you're going to see a trend. You're seeing it in securities with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD. It's a set of standards for climate risk disclosure in securities and security filing. I think you're going to see that happening more. All big corporations are now starting to do climate risk assessments. Guess what they're going to think about it? Where do I put my offices and where do I put my plants? And they're going to want to know it's going to be another thing along with your property tax rates, availability of labor, good business environment. They're going to say, what are you doing about resilience and how does this affect vulnerability of my supply chain? So I think the more you get price signals that reflect this level of risk, the faster capital will flow into resilience projects.
I would say a point from your question, though, that we should all stay aware of is this another way we're going to be screwing those low-income communities that don't have the capacity to do the work? And so for those of you out there who are really thinking about environmental justice and communities of color in this country, this is another reason to make sure that we're not leaving them behind in this conversation. So, Susie, you have a question?
That was exactly my question. How can we not lose what we have worked so hard to actually get into the conversation, which is the social equity dimension and the legacy of inequity for decades, centuries in this country and beyond?
I wonder if Brandy has some thoughts working with some of these small communities. I mean, it's for all.
That's a very difficult question, and I think we're struggling with that even today before the Moody's ratings have changed things. I know that one thing that we can do is really rely on sort of the philanthropic dollars and really trying to get them to sort of see the initial projects so that hopefully we can stave off that issue as we move forward. But I think that's the $1,000,000 question is how are we going to make sure that we all float as opposed to letting the folks who are already disenfranchised fall behind? I don't know if anyone has a better...
We're one of the communities that we may be working with, we're waiting for their application now, is down on in Tidewater, Virginia, and they're wrestling directly with climate-related flooding issues. And they are a vastly underprivileged community, vastly under-resourced. But they have actually a fairly progressive government. And they have a stormwater fee. So there's a start there of recognizing some of what they need to do. They've started some green planning. And they want, what they're thinking about as their pilot project that they would use this money for is to deal with, to put green infrastructure solutions along a stream that is quite near to tidal areas. and is populated by underprivileged communities, underserved communities. So it's kind of a combination of things, but I think the opportunity is there if there's the spark in that community. We can't make that spark happen, but perhaps we can recognize it and let it bloom.
I would also say that this is really a big argument for why the states really need to take a much larger role. Because, to deal with these equities, you have to redistribute some wealth, right? Well, generally, wealth redistribution at the municipal level is not that efficient. It generally would happen at the state level, taking money out of state coffers and actually investing it and giving the communities that don't have the resources to do this actual cash to do it. And that really more efficiently happens at the state level than done at the municipal.
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important point. And at the Climate Bonds Initiative's conference at the end of March, we had a whole panel session focused on the concept of the just transition. And there has been traction within kind of the bond community thinking about sustainability bonds or bonds aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals that really take into account the impact within communities and having a positive impact in terms of decreasing inequality and dealing with equity issues being something that would make that bond have more value to a wide array of investors who are really focused on this as a key issue.
So we've got time for one more question. Has anyone got a burning question? Yes?
Hi. A lot of what you're talking about is looking at sort of resilience, protecting places that are already there, and financing that through, say, the tax base that would be maintained. But as we all know, like, say, the Jersey Barrier Islands, New Jersey Barrier Islands, which are very heavily populated, cannot all be protected. How do you finance a large relocation of population, even from Manhattan Island or neighborhoods of Boston or the Barrier Islands, which we're going to have to do at some point, or Miami Beach? There's a very interesting for the next 50, 100 years to make some money off of bonds that are building large pieces of infrastructure, but eventually that infrastructure is bound to fail in most of these places with 6, 7, 10 feet of sea level rise.
We're doing a small project on managed retreat. I think it's the third rail of adaptation, and I haven't found anybody who's really willing to talk about it in an organized kind of way because of the political volatility of it. And if you look at the small cases, and they're really small cases, I grew up in the wilds of Alaska. Several of the villages that we used to spend time in are going into the ocean. And you look at the cost of what it takes to relocate, it's like $300,000 a household. When you start running those numbers, you can't, there's no way you can pay for that. I think we need a really deep and long conversation about managed retreat, how you manage it, how you don't, how you make the decisions, the protection, the numbers don't work, so to speak, that the cost of protection exceeds the value of it, and figure out how we do that. When will we pay for relocation into some places, and when will we not? And how do we we need to send the right signals. The Consensus Building Institute in Cambridge, some of you may know about, is doing an interesting project, and they have a little website called climigration.org. Because the managed retreat is kind of related to this whole issue of climate migration, which, by the way, in other areas of the world is like way bigger, an issue than here. And what they've found that's really effective is not organizing governments, but organizing the residents and property owners around so that they get signals that are the appropriate signals. And I don't think, we don't have a good framework for adaptation finance system. We have zero framework for even thinking about managed retreat, and that's a project we need to take on.
And I think what was mentioned by, I've forgotten, I apologize, it was one of you before, is to have the risk, having property owners pay for the real risk, right? So if you're wiped out, your home is wiped out, are you rebuilding? Well, there should be some real good price signals about that. and that might have had an influence over time. But this is going to be a great question for a future Antioch conference. Don't you think? Like, how do we, if we are planning and thinking forward to a time horizon that's 50, 100 years forward, we're going to have a pretty different looking landscape under any scenario. So how do we envision that and create the infrastructure to help make that a smoother transition? So again, thank you so much for the panel, and thank you for sticking with us.
Thank you, panelists, and thank all of you for being here. A reminder to please fill out the evaluation forms, and I would be incredibly remiss if I let you leave this plenary hall without first giving a round of applause to the many, many people who were on the team that made this conference possible. Under the leadership of Krista Daniels, who's Dr. Krista Daniels, who successfully defended her dissertation just a few months ago. There's a big team. It takes a lot of effort to do this. And so I'm grateful to the team that has made this possible. I invite you all back for 2020. And I wish you well in terms of the work that you're doing out there in the world. You're being change leaders in the face of a changing climate. So thank you all. Enjoy the last session of the day, and safe travels to you wherever you're headed.